The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the palace as Captain Marcus stood at attention in the grand hall. His weathered hands gripped the ceremonial sword at his side, a weapon that had seen 23 years of faithful service to the crown. The golden armor he wore bore the marks of countless battles, each scratch and dent telling a story of unwavering loyalty to the kingdom. King Aldrich entered the hall with heavy footsteps that echoed through the vast chamber. His purple robe swept behind him as he walked, the golden crown upon his head catching the light from the stained glass windows above. The king's face was stern, his jaw set in a way that made the assembled courtiers shift nervously in their positions along the walls. Marcus had served under 3 different kings during his time as captain of the royal guard. He had watched young Prince Aldrich grow from a spoiled child into the man who now ruled the kingdom. The captain remembered teaching the prince swordsmanship in the very courtyard, visible through the tall windows. He remembered the boy's laughter echoing through these same halls, back when joy seemed to live within these walls. But those days felt like distant memories now. The kingdom had changed in the 5 years since Aldrich took the throne. The people whispered in the streets about heavier taxes and harsher punishments. Merchants complained about new laws that made trade difficult. Farmers struggled under regulations that seemed designed more to fill the royal treasury than to help the common folk. As the king approached, Marcus noticed something different in the monarch's eyes. There was a coldness there that hadn't existed before, a hardness that seemed to have grown with each passing season. The captain had seen this look in other rulers throughout history, men who had forgotten that their power came from the people they served. "Captain Marcus," the king's voice boomed across the hall, causing several servants to freeze in their duties. "You have served this crown for more than 2 decades, have you not?" "Yes, your majesty," Marcus replied, his voice steady and clear. 23 years of faithful service to the throne and the people of this kingdom." The king circled around the captain slowly, his eyes studying the older man as if seeing him for the first time. 23 years, he repeated, his voice carrying a tone that made the courtiers lean forward slightly. "And in all that time you have never questioned an order, never hesitated to carry out the will of the crown." Marcus kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. Though he could feel the weight of every person in the hall watching this exchange, something was building here, something that felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with swords or battles. This was the kind of danger that came from words and power, from the corruption that could eat away at even the noblest of hearts. "That is correct, your majesty," Marcus answered. "My oath was sworn to protect and serve, and I have never wavered in that commitment." King Aldrich stopped directly in front of the captain, close enough that Marcus could see the flecks of gold in the monarch's brown eyes. "And yet," the king said slowly, "I sense something has changed. There's a certain distance in your manner lately, a hesitation that wasn't there before." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his sword at his side, not as a weapon but as a symbol of everything he had dedicated his life to protecting.
He thought of the oath he had sworn all those years ago, kneeling in this very hall before Aldrich's father, King Edmund the Just. The old king had been different.
He had walked among his people, listened to their concerns, and made decisions based on wisdom rather than whim. Edmund had understood that true power came not from forcing others to submit, but from earning their respect and trust. He had been a king who bowed to no one, yet somehow made everyone feel valued. "I serve the crown with the same dedication I have always shown," Marcus said carefully. "My loyalty has never been in question, nor will it ever be." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew that something fundamental was shifting in the kingdom. The servants who once smiled as they went about their work now kept their heads down, afraid to meet anyone's gaze. The nobles who had once engaged in lively debates about policy now sat in silent agreement with whatever the king proposed. Fear had replaced respect, and obedience had taken the place of loyalty. King Aldrich seemed to sense the captain's internal struggle. A thin smile played at the corners of his mouth, the kind of expression a cat might wear while watching a mouse realize it was trapped. "Loyalty," he mused. Such an interesting concept. "Tell me, Captain, to whom exactly is your loyalty pledged?" The question struck Marcus like a physical blow. In all his years of service, no king had ever asked him such a thing. The answer had always been clear, written in the very foundations of the kingdom's laws and traditions. A captain's loyalty belonged to the crown, But the crown's loyalty belonged to the people. My loyalty is pledged to the throne. Your Majesty, Marcus replied, but he could hear his own voice sounding different somehow, as if the words carried weight they had never held before. The throne, the king repeated thoughtfully. Not to me personally, but to the throne itself. How very traditional of you, Captain. The way Aldrich spoke the word traditional made it sound like an insult. Marcus realized that this conversation was heading somewhere he might not be able to follow, somewhere that would force him to choose between the oath he had sworn and the conscience that had guided him through decades of service. Around them, the great hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next between the aging captain and the young king, who seemed determined to test the very foundations upon which their kingdom had been built. The tension in the great hall grew thicker with each passing moment, as King Aldrich continued his slow circle around Captain Marcus. The assembled courtiers had stopped pretending to go about their business, their attention now fully focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. Even the servants had paused in their duties, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Marcus could feel sweat beginning to form beneath his armor, despite the cool morning air that drifted through the tall windows. He had faced charging cavalry, defended castle walls against siege engines, and stood firm against overwhelming odds in battle. Yet something about this moment felt more dangerous than any sword fight he had ever experienced. You speak of tradition, Captain, the king continued, his voice carrying across the marble floors. But traditions can become obstacles to progress. Sometimes old ways must be adjusted to fit new realities. The captain's mind raced as he tried to understand where this conversation was leading. He thought about the changes he had witnessed in recent months. Good men had been dismissed from positions they had held for years, replaced by younger nobles who seemed more concerned with pleasing the king than serving the kingdom. Laws that had protected the common people for generations had been quietly altered, always with reasonable explanations that somehow left the poor worse off than before. Your Majesty, Marcus said carefully, the traditions of this kingdom have served it well for over 3 centuries. They have brought peace, prosperity, and justice to our people. King Aldrich stopped walking and turned to face the captain directly. His eyes held a gleam that Marcus had seen before in men who had tasted power and found themselves hungry for more. It was a look that had appeared in the eyes of tyrants throughout history, though they rarely recognized it in themselves. Justice, the king repeated, as if tasting the word. Tell me, Captain, who decides what justice means? Who determines what is right and what is wrong within these borders? Marcus felt the familiar weight of his ceremonial sword, but it provided no comfort now. The blade at his side had been forged by the kingdom's finest smiths and blessed by the high priest himself. Engraved along its length were the words that had guided every captain of the royal guard: honor, duty, truth. Those 3 principles had been the foundation of his service, the bedrock upon which he had built his entire adult life. Justice comes from the law, Your Majesty, Marcus replied, from the ancient codes that govern our kingdom and protect all who dwell within it, from the highest noble to the humblest farmer. The king's smile grew wider, but there was no warmth in it. The law, he said softly. But who writes the law, Captain? Who has the power to change it, to shape it according to the needs of the kingdom? Marcus understood now where this was heading, and the realization filled him with a cold dread that had nothing to do with personal fear. This was about more than one man's ambition or one captain's loyalty. This was about the very soul of the kingdom, about whether they would remain a land where justice was something larger than any single person's will. The law is written by the wisdom of ages. Your Majesty, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, it is shaped by the collective understanding of what serves the greater good, not by the desires of any one individual, no matter how high their station. A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers at these words. Some shifted uncomfortably while others nodded almost imperceptibly in agreement. Marcus realized that he was not alone in his concerns about the direction the kingdom was taking. There were others who remembered what their homeland had been like under King Edmund's rule, others who valued the old ways. King Aldrich's expression darkened at the captain's words. You speak as if the crown is just another voice among many, he said, his tone growing colder. As if a king is merely a servant to laws written by dead men who knew nothing of the challenges we face today. The crown is the guardian of those laws, Your Majesty, Marcus replied. It is the protector of justice, not its master. Even kings are bound by the principles that make our kingdom great. The words hung in the air like a challenge, though Marcus had not intended them as such. He had simply spoken the truth as he understood it, the same truth that had been taught to him by his predecessor, old Captain Willem, who had served King Edmund with distinction for 40 years. Willem had been a man of few words but great wisdom. On his deathbed, he had called Marcus to his side and spoken about the true nature of service to the crown. "The crown is not a man," he had whispered with his final breath. "It is an idea, a promise made to every person in this kingdom that they will be protected, that justice will prevail, that power will not corrupt those who wield it. That promise is what we serve, boy. Remember that when times grow dark." Those words echoed in Marcus's mind now as he stood before a king who seemed determined to redefine what the crown meant. Around them, the great hall had fallen completely silent, as if the very stones of the palace were waiting to hear what would happen next. King Aldrich stepped closer to the captain, close enough that his voice would not carry to the listening courtiers. "You are walking a dangerous path, old man," he said quietly. "I would hate to see your long service end in disgrace." Marcus met the king's gaze steadily. "My service will end when I draw my last breath, your majesty. Until that moment, I will continue to uphold the oath I swore to this kingdom and its people." The king's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or perhaps recognition of an immovable obstacle. He straightened and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Very well, Captain. Since you are so devoted to tradition and ancient customs, let us see just how deep that devotion runs." King Aldrich stepped back and raised his voice so that every person in the great hall could hear his words clearly. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to dim as clouds passed overhead, casting shifting patterns of color across the marble floor where captain and king faced each other. "In the old traditions you speak of so fondly, Captain Marcus," the king began, his voice carrying a theatrical quality that made Marcus's stomach tighten with apprehension, "there are certain gestures of respect that subjects are expected to show their sovereign. Gestures that have been overlooked in recent years, but perhaps it is time to restore them." Marcus felt every eye in the hall focused on him. He could sense the nervous energy radiating from the courtiers, the way servants had stopped moving entirely, even the way the very air seemed to have grown heavier. Whatever was coming, everyone knew it would change something fundamental about their world. "Throughout history," the king continued, beginning to pace again, "subjects have shown their respect for the crown through various means. They have removed their hats, bowed their heads, bent their knees. These are not mere customs, Captain. They are acknowledgments of the natural order, the hierarchy that keeps our kingdom stable and strong." The captain's mind raced through his knowledge of royal protocol and ancient customs. He had studied the histories, knew the old ways as well as any scholar. But he also knew that many of those traditions had been deliberately set aside by wise kings who understood that true respect could not be forced, only earned. King Edmund had never demanded that his guards bow to him. He had walked among them as a leader among equals, understanding that men who risked their lives for the crown deserved to maintain their dignity. The old king had often said that a man who bowed only because he was forced to was not truly loyal, merely afraid. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "the royal guard has always shown proper respect to the crown. We stand at attention, we salute, we follow orders without question. These have been our traditions for generations." "But you do not bow," the king said, stopping his pacing to face the captain directly. "You do not kneel. You do not humble yourself before the throne as others do. Why is that, Captain? Do you consider yourself above such gestures?" The question struck at the heart of something Marcus had never fully examined. He had served 3 kings and never once had any of them demanded that he bow. It had been understood that the captain of the royal guard stood as a symbol of strength and dignity, a reminder that even the crown depended on the loyalty of free men who chose to serve. The captain of the royal guard has traditionally stood at attention as a mark of readiness to serve. Marcus replied, "We are always prepared to act, to defend, to lay down our lives if necessary. Bowing has never been required of our position." King Aldrich's smile returned, but it held no warmth. "Traditions change, Captain. New kings bring new ways of doing things, and I believe it is time for all my subjects, regardless of their position, to show proper deference to the crown." A chill ran down Marcus's spine as he began to understand what was happening. This was not about respect or tradition. This was about breaking the spirit of anyone who might stand against the king's will. If the captain of the royal guard could be made to bow, then no one in the kingdom would be beyond the monarch's reach. Around the hall, Marcus could see the faces of men and women who had served the crown for years. Some looked terrified, others angry, and a few seemed resigned to whatever was about to happen. But in the eyes of several, he saw something else. Hope that someone would finally stand up to what their kingdom was becoming. "You want me to bow?" Marcus said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "I do not want anything, Captain." The king replied smoothly, "I am commanding it. As your sovereign, as the voice of the crown you claim to serve so faithfully, I am ordering you to kneel before me and show the proper respect that your king deserves." The words echoed through the great hall like the tolling of a funeral bell. Marcus felt the weight of 23 years of service pressing down on his shoulders, along with the expectations of every person watching this confrontation. He thought of his wife, Elena, who worried about him every day. He thought of his son, Thomas, who was following in his footsteps as a junior guard. He thought of the hundreds of men who had served under his command, trusting him to lead them with honor. But most of all, he thought of old Captain Willem's final words about what they truly served. Not a man, but an idea. Not a person, but a promise. The crown was more than whoever happened to wear it at any given moment. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I have served this crown with everything I have. I have bled for it, fought for it, and would gladly die for it. But the crown I serve stands for justice, for the protection of the innocent, for the idea that power must be balanced by responsibility." King Aldric's face began to darken with anger. "You will bow, Captain, or you will face the consequences of defying your king." Marcus felt something inside him settle into place, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed now by a clarity that surprised him with its strength. He knew what he had to do, regardless of the cost. "The crown I swore to serve would never demand that a free man bow against his conscience," Marcus said. "If you are truly the voice of that crown, then you would understand that true loyalty cannot be forced. It can only be given freely by those who believe in what they are serving." The king's face flushed red with rage. "How dare you question my authority? How dare you stand there and lecture me about the nature of the crown?" "I do not question your authority, Your Majesty," Marcus replied calmly. "I question whether you understand where that authority comes from, and what responsibilities come with it." The great hall had become so quiet that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. King Aldric's face had turned a deep shade of red, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The assembled courtiers seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. "You speak to me of responsibility," the king said, his voice low and dangerous. "You, a mere soldier, dare to lecture your sovereign about the duties of kingship. Do you have any idea what it means to rule a kingdom? Do you understand the weight of making decisions that affect thousands of lives?" Marcus could hear the pain beneath the anger in the king's voice, and for a moment, he remembered the young prince who had once asked him about the burden of leadership. That boy had been genuinely concerned about whether he would be worthy of the crown when his time came. Somewhere along the way, that concern had twisted into something else entirely. "I understand that leadership is a burden, Your Majesty," Marcus replied gently. "I have led men into battle, made decisions that cost good soldiers their lives. I know what it means to carry the weight of other people's trust. But that weight should make a leader humble, not arrogant. It should remind him that power is a tool for service, not domination." The king's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Humble? You want me to be humble while neighboring kingdoms grow stronger? While merchants cheat the royal treasury? While nobles plot in shadows and commoners complain about every decision I make? A humble king is a weak king, Captain, and weak kings lose their kingdoms." Marcus saw something in the king's eyes then that made his heart ache. It was fear. Aldric was afraid, terrified that he wasn't strong enough to protect what his father had built. That fear had driven him to grasp for more and more control, believing that absolute power was the only way to ensure absolute security. "Your father was not weak," Marcus said quietly. "King Edmund was one of the strongest men I ever knew, but his strength came from his willingness to listen, to admit when he was wrong, to trust in the wisdom of others. He understood that a king who stands alone will eventually fall alone. My father is dead," Aldrich shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. His gentle ways, his trust in others, his precious principles, where did they get him? He died in his bed while enemies gathered at our borders and corruption spread through his court. If I had not acted decisively, this kingdom would have fallen within a year of his death. The raw emotion in the king's voice made several courtiers shift uncomfortably. This was not the controlled, calculating monarch they had grown accustomed to seeing. This was a frightened young man who had convinced himself that cruelty was strength and fear was respect. Marcus took a careful step forward, his voice remaining calm and steady. "Your Majesty, your father died peacefully because he had built a kingdom strong enough to survive without him. The enemies you speak of were held at bay by alliances he had forged through decades of fair dealing. The corruption you fought was real, but it was a symptom, not the disease itself. And what would you know about ruling a kingdom?" The king demanded. "You follow orders, Captain. You do not make the difficult decisions. You do not bear the responsibility for success or failure." "You are right," Marcus admitted. "I do not know what it is like to wear the crown, but I know what it is like to serve something greater than myself. I know what it means to put the welfare of others before my own comfort. And I know that the moment a leader starts demanding submission instead of earning respect, he has already begun to lose what he is trying so desperately to protect." The words hit their mark. King Aldrich's face went pale, and for a moment Marcus thought he saw a flicker of the boy who had once asked such thoughtful questions about justice and mercy. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by a hardness that seemed to have become the king's default expression. "Enough," Aldrich said, his voice cold and controlled once again. "I have listened to your philosophy long enough, Captain. You will bow to me now, or you will be stripped of your rank and thrown into the dungeons as a traitor to the crown." Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the hall upon him. He could see fear in some faces, hope in others, and resignation in still others. These people had watched their kingdom change over the past 5 years, had seen good men and women dismissed for speaking uncomfortable truths. They were waiting to see if anyone would finally say no to the path their country was taking. The captain thought of his oath, sworn 23 years ago in this very hall. He had pledged to serve the crown, to protect the kingdom, and to uphold justice. Those 3 commitments had guided every decision he had made since that day. Now they were pulling him in different directions, forcing him to choose which aspect of his duty mattered most. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I will not bow to you." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Several courtiers stepped back as if expecting violence to erupt at any moment. But Marcus stood perfectly still, his hand nowhere near his sword, his posture respectful but unbending. "I will not bow," he continued, "because the crown I serve does not demand submission from free men. The kingdom I have protected for 23 years was built on the idea that even kings are bound by justice. If you truly speak for that crown, then you would not ask me to betray everything it represents." King Aldrich's face had gone from red to white to red again. His whole body was trembling with rage, and Marcus could see that the young king was struggling to maintain control. This was the moment of truth, the point where everything would be decided. The silence that followed Marcus's refusal seemed to stretch on forever. King Aldrich stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of rage, disbelief, and something that might have been hurt. The assembled courtiers waited with bated breath, knowing that whatever happened next would echo through the kingdom for years to come. Marcus could feel his heart pounding, but his breathing remained steady. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, spoken words that could never be taken back, yet he felt a strange sense of peace, as if he had finally remembered who he truly was after years of slowly forgetting. "You refuse your king," Aldrich said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "In front of the entire court, you openly defy the crown you claim to serve." "I serve the crown, Your Majesty," Marcus replied firmly, "but I will not pretend that every action taken in its name is worthy of respect. The crown represents justice, mercy, and the protection of the innocent. If those principles have no meaning, then the crown itself has no meaning." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles and servants. Marcus could see some nodding in agreement, while others looked terrified at such open defiance. But he also noticed something else. Several of the younger guards stationed around the hall were standing a little straighter, their eyes bright with something that looked like pride. King Aldrich began to pace again, his hands clasped behind his back. his mind clearly racing through the implications of what was happening. "Do you realize what you have done, Captain? Do you understand that your defiance undermines the very foundation of royal authority? If the captain of the royal guard can simply refuse to obey his king, what message does that send to every noble, every merchant, every farmer in the kingdom?" Marcus had considered this question during the long, sleepless nights, when he had wrestled with his growing unease about the kingdom's direction. "It sends the message that there are some things more important than blind obedience, Your Majesty. It reminds people that even those in positions of power are accountable to higher principles." "Higher principles?" The king scoffed. "What could be higher than the authority of the crown? What power exists above that of the king?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus realized that this was the heart of everything that had gone wrong. King Aldrich truly believed that his will was the highest law in the land, that his desires were more important than the welfare of his people. He had forgotten the fundamental truth that made kingdoms great. Power without wisdom was merely tyranny with a crown. "The welfare of the people, Your Majesty," Marcus said simply. "The future of the kingdom, the ideals that made this nation worth building in the first place. Those are the powers that stand above any single ruler, no matter how high his throne." Several courtiers gasped at this statement, and Marcus could see genuine fear in their eyes. They knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that could change everything about how their world worked. Some seemed excited by the possibility, while others appeared terrified of the chaos they imagined would follow. King Aldrich stopped pacing and faced the captain directly. "You speak of the people as if you know their minds better than I do. You talk about the future as if you can see it more clearly than their anointed king. Tell me, Captain, what gives you such wisdom? What makes you think you understand the needs of this kingdom better than the man who was born to rule it?" Marcus looked around the great hall, taking in the faces of people he had known for years, servants who had worked in the palace since his early days as a guard, nobles who had watched him grow from a young soldier into the captain of the royal guard. Men and women who remembered what the kingdom had been like under King Edmund's wise and gentle rule. "I do not claim to be wiser than you, Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "but I have walked among the people of this kingdom for more than 20 years. I have spoken with farmers in their fields, merchants in their shops, mothers worried about feeding their children. I have seen how the changes of recent years have affected their lives." The king's expression hardened. "And what have you seen? Prosperity? Order, security? This kingdom is stronger now than it has been in decades. Our enemies fear us, our treasury is full, and our borders are secure. What more could the people want?" Marcus felt a deep sadness wash over him, as he realized how isolated the king had become from the reality of his subjects' lives. "They want to feel safe in their own homes, Your Majesty. They want to know that their children will have opportunities to build good lives. They want to believe that justice applies to everyone, not just those with enough gold to buy it." "Justice?" The king laughed bitterly. "I have brought order to chaos, strength to weakness. The merchants who complain about my taxes are the same ones who profited from corruption under my father's rule. The nobles who whisper about my methods are the ones who would plunge this kingdom back into the inefficient softness that nearly destroyed us." Marcus could see that the king genuinely believed what he was saying. In his mind, every harsh measure was justified by necessity. Every cruel act was really kindness in disguise. He had convinced himself that fear was love, that submission was loyalty. That strength could only be demonstrated through dominance. "Your Majesty," Marcus said gently, "strength that requires fear to maintain itself is not true strength. It is weakness disguised as power. A king who must force his subjects to respect him has already lost their hearts, and a kingdom without the hearts of its people is already beginning to fall." The words struck home harder than Marcus had expected. King Aldrich's face went pale, and for a moment the captain saw past the anger and arrogance to the frightened young man beneath. This was someone who had convinced himself that cruelty was necessary, but who deep down still remembered what kindness felt like. For a long moment, King Aldrich stood perfectly still, staring at Captain Marcus with an expression that seemed to shift between rage and something much more vulnerable. The great hall remained silent except for the soft whisper of wind through the tall windows and the distant sound of everyday life continuing in the palace courtyards. Beyond it, Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out across the king's features. There was still a part of Aldrich that remembered his father's teachings, still a fragment of the idealistic young prince who had once asked thoughtful questions about what it meant to be a good ruler. But that part was at war with the fear and isolation that had shaped his reign. "You think I do not care about my people," the king said finally, his voice quieter than it had been throughout their confrontation. "You believe I have forgotten what it means to serve something greater than myself?" "I think you care very much, Your Majesty," Marcus replied honestly. "I think you care so much that it frightens you. The responsibility weighs on you every day, and you have convinced yourself that being feared is safer than being loved, because love can be lost, but fear can be maintained through force." Several courtiers shifted uncomfortably at this analysis, clearly not accustomed to hearing their king's motivations discussed so openly. But Marcus noticed that some of the older nobles were nodding slightly, as if they too had recognized the pain that drove their monarch's increasingly harsh decisions. King Aldrich turned away from the captain, walking toward one of the tall windows that looked out over the palace gardens. In the distance they could see gardeners tending to the flowers that had been planted by his father, common folk who went about their work with the easy contentment of people who felt secure in their positions. "Do you know what it was like?" the king said, still facing the window. "To watch my father die knowing that I would never be half the king he was? To inherit a throne when you are certain you will destroy everything your ancestors built?" The raw honesty in his voice surprised everyone in the hall. This was not the calculating tyrant they had grown accustomed to seeing, but a young man burdened by expectations he had never felt worthy of meeting. Marcus took a careful step closer. "Your father had the same fears when he became king, Your Majesty. I remember him telling me that he spent the first year of his reign convinced that he would make some terrible mistake that would ruin the kingdom. But he learned to trust in the wisdom of others, to accept that no one person, no matter how well-intentioned, could govern alone. And look where that trust got him," Aldrich said bitterly, betrayed by advisors who cared more about their own interests than the kingdom's welfare. Manipulated by nobles who saw his kindness as weakness, he died believing he had built something lasting, never knowing how close it all came to collapse the moment he was gone. Marcus felt a chill of understanding. The king's harshness had not grown from cruelty, but from a desperate attempt to prevent the kingdom from falling apart. He had seen threats everywhere because he had been taught to believe that everyone was potentially an enemy, that trust was a luxury kings could not afford. "Who told you these things?" Marcus asked quietly. "Who convinced you that your father's reign was a failure?" The king's shoulders tensed and Marcus could see that he had struck at something important. "It does not matter who told me," Aldrich said. "I saw the evidence with my own eyes. The corruption in the treasury, the disloyalty among the nobles, the weakness in our defenses. My father's gentle methods had left the kingdom vulnerable to anyone strong enough to take advantage." "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "I served your father for 18 years. I saw the kingdom he built, not the version someone else wanted you to see. Yes, there were problems, but they were not caused by his kindness. They were caused by people who took advantage of that kindness for their own gain." The king turned back to face Marcus, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then how do I protect what he built without becoming the kind of ruler who crushes everything good about this kingdom? How do I be strong enough to defend our people without becoming someone they should fear?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, and Marcus realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward. Not a test of loyalty or a display of power, but a desperate plea for guidance from a young man who had lost his way. "You start by remembering that true strength comes from standing with your people, not over them," Marcus said gently. "You build loyalty by earning it, not demanding it. You create security by making your subjects feel valued, not threatened." "But what if that is not enough?" the king asked. "What if being kind makes me weak? What if trusting others leads to betrayal?" Marcus thought of all the battles he had fought, all the difficult decisions he had made as captain of the guard. "Your Majesty, kindness is not weakness any more than cruelty is strength. I have seen men follow kind leaders into certain death because they believed in what they were fighting for. I have also seen armies abandon cruel commanders at the first sign of trouble because fear alone is never enough to inspire true loyalty." The king was quiet for a long moment, absorbing these words. Around them, the court waited in tense silence, sensing that something fundamental was shifting in their ruler. Some seemed hopeful, others nervous about what changes might come. "And if I choose this path," Aldrich said slowly, "if I try to rule as my father did, Will you serve me? Will you bow to a king who seeks to earn respect rather than demand it? Marcus felt the weight of the moment, the importance of his answer not just for himself but for everyone in the kingdom. This was the choice that would define not just his own future, but the future of every person who called this land home. Your Majesty, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the great hall, I will serve a king who serves his people. I will bow to a ruler who bows to justice. I will follow a leader who leads with wisdom rather than fear. But most importantly, I will stand beside a man who remembers that the crown is not a prize to be grasped, but a burden to be carried for the good of all. King Aldrich stared at the captain for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly something changed in his expression. The hardness that had defined his features for so long began to soften, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. The transformation in King Aldrich's face was visible to everyone in the great hall. The mask of cold authority that he had worn for so long seemed to crack and fall away, revealing the uncertain but well-intentioned young man who had been hidden beneath. For the first time in years, he looked less like a king trying to project power, and more like a person seeking to do what was right. Captain Marcus, the king said, his voice carrying a warmth that many in the hall had not heard since his father's time. You have shown me something today that I had forgotten. You have reminded me that true loyalty cannot be commanded, only inspired. That real strength comes not from making others fear you, but from making them believe in you. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he tried not to let it show on his face. Around the hall, he could see similar expressions on the faces of courtiers and servants who had watched this confrontation with growing anxiety. But there was something else in their expressions now. Hope. I have made mistakes, the king continued, addressing not just Marcus, but the entire assembled court. In my fear of being weak, I became something worse than weak. I became unjust. In my desire to protect this kingdom, I forgot what made it worth protecting in the first place. Several of the older nobles stepped forward slightly, as if drawn by the sincerity in their young king's voice. These were men and women who had served his father faithfully, and had watched with growing concern as Aldrich's reign had taken such a harsh turn. Now they saw the possibility of something better, something closer to the kingdom they remembered. King Aldrich walked back toward Marcus, but this time his approach felt different. There was no menace in his stride, no calculation in his eyes. He moved like someone who had set down a heavy burden and was still adjusting to the freedom that came with its absence. I asked you to bow to me, the king said when he reached the captain. I demanded submission as if that could somehow make me worthy of respect. But I see now that I had it backwards. A king who is truly worthy of the crown does not demand that others bow to him. The king paused, and Marcus could see him gathering his courage for what came next. Around them, the great hall held its breath once again, but this time the tension felt different. Instead of the dangerous energy that had filled the space during their confrontation, there was now an almost electric sense of anticipation. A king who is worthy of the crown, Aldrich continued, bows to something greater than himself. And then, to the amazement of everyone present, King Aldrich slowly lowered himself to one knee before Captain Marcus. But it was clear that he was not bowing to the man himself. He was bowing to what Marcus represented, the ideals of justice, honor, and service that had made their kingdom great. I bow to the principles that should guide every ruler, the king said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. I bow to justice, to mercy, to the welfare of my people. I bow to the idea that power is a tool for service, not domination. And I bow to the courage of those who are willing to stand up for what is right, even when it costs them everything. Marcus felt tears threatening to blur his vision as he watched this remarkable transformation. This was not the same man who had entered the hall that morning demanding blind obedience. This was a king who had remembered what kingship truly meant. Your Majesty, Marcus said softly, please rise. A king should bow to principles, but he should stand among his people as their servant and protector. King Aldrich rose slowly, and when he faced Marcus again, there was something new in his eyes. The fear and anger that had driven him for so long had been replaced by determination and hope. He looked like a man who had found his way back to a path he had lost years ago. Captain Marcus, the king said formally, I would be honored if you would continue to serve as captain of the Royal Guard, but I want you to know that I will never again ask you to choose between your loyalty to the crown and your loyalty to justice. From this day forward, they will be the same thing. Marcus stood at attention and saluted his king, but it was a different kind of salute than any he had given in recent years. This was not the mechanical gesture of a soldier following orders, but the heartfelt acknowledgement of a man who truly believed in what he was serving. "It would be my honor to serve, Your Majesty," Marcus replied. "To serve a king who understands that the crown belongs not to the man who wears it, but to the people who trust him with it." As word of what had happened in the great hall spread throughout the palace and then beyond its walls, something began to change in the kingdom. The servants went about their duties with lighter steps. The nobles spoke more freely in council meetings. The guards stood taller at their posts, knowing that they served something worthy of their dedication. And in the months that followed, as King Aldrich worked to undo the damage his fear had caused, the people began to remember what it felt like to be proud of their kingdom again. They saw their king walking among them, listening to their concerns, working to solve their problems rather than simply silencing their complaints. Captain Marcus continued to serve faithfully, but now his service felt different. He was no longer just following orders or maintaining traditions. He was part of something larger, something that truly mattered. He was helping to protect not just a kingdom, but an idea. The idea that power and justice could work together, that strength and kindness were not opposites, and that the best leaders were those who never forgot they were servants first and rulers second. Years later, when historians wrote about the day that changed the kingdom, they would call it the moment when a king learned to bow. But those who were there knew it was really the day when everyone learned what it truly meant to stand tall.